My son slammed a white envelope onto the dining table so hard that my coffee spilled across the newspaper. He looked straight into my eyes and said, "Dad, before this day ends, I am going to prove you lied to our family for 42 years. My wife froze in the kitchen doorway. My daughter dropped the plates she was carrying. My grandchildren stopped laughing and stared at us in complete silence. I looked at the envelope without touching it. Across the front, in bold black letters, were the words DNA paternity results. My name is Richard Collins. I am 73 years old, and until that morning, I believed I had survived every hardship life could throw at me. I was wrong. My son Daniel had secretly taken a DNA test without telling anyone. He believed I was hiding a terrible family secret. His face was filled with anger instead of fear. "I always knew something did not make sense," he said. "People kept saying I do not look like you." I finally decided to learn the truth. I slowly stood up and looked at him. "Daniel, there are some doors that should never be opened without love." He shook his head. "Truth matters more than love." Those words cut deeper than he could ever imagine. For 42 years, I had raised him with everything I had. I worked 2 jobs so he could attend college. I sold my dream truck to pay for his first home. I sat beside his hospital bed for 6 nights when he nearly died from pneumonia at the age of 9. Not once had I ever thought of him as anything except my son. Yet now he looked at me as though I were a stranger standing inside his home. My wife Margaret quietly stepped between us. Tears filled her eyes as she whispered, "Daniel, please do not open that envelope here." He looked at her with disappointment. "Mom, if he has nothing to hide, why are you both afraid?" I closed my eyes for a brief moment. My heart was pounding so loudly I could barely hear the clock ticking on the wall. Then Daniel picked up the envelope again, tore it open in front of the entire family, unfolded the report with shaking hands, and after reading the first line, the color disappeared from his face. Without saying a single word, he looked at me as though his entire world had just collapsed. Daniel stared at the DNA report as though it had suddenly become impossible to read. His hands trembled so badly that the papers nearly slipped onto the floor. The anger that had filled his face only seconds earlier vanished, replaced by complete disbelief. My wife slowly stepped toward him. "Daniel, what does it say?" she asked softly. He did not answer. He continued staring at the report before whispering, This cannot be right." I remained standing beside the table, saying nothing. After several long seconds, Daniel finally looked at me. His eyes were filled with fear instead of anger. "Dad, the report says you are my biological father." The room became completely silent. Margaret closed her eyes and quietly thanked God under her breath. My daughter let out a long sigh of relief, but I noticed something that no one else saw. Daniel was not relieved. He was terrified. "Then why," he whispered, "why did Grandpa tell me my entire life that you were hiding the truth?" Hearing those words sent a chill through my body. I had not heard my late father's name spoken like that in years. I slowly pulled out a chair and sat down. "Your grandfather told you that?" Daniel nodded. "Ever since I was a teenager, he kept saying I deserved to know who my real father was. Every birthday, every Christmas, he hinted that Mom and you were lying to me. I ignored him for years, but after he passed away, I found a letter inside his desk." He reached into his jacket and placed another yellow envelope beside the DNA report. He wrote that if I truly wanted answers, I should secretly take a DNA test because the results would expose both of you. Margaret covered her mouth with both hands as tears rolled down her face. "He actually did it," she whispered. Daniel looked at me with regret. "Dad, I believed him. I thought you had stolen someone else's life." I slowly picked up the old envelope. The handwriting on the front belonged to my own father. Before opening it, I quietly asked, "Did you read all of it?" Daniel shook his head. "Only the first page." My heart sank. My father had a habit of hiding important pages inside folded letters. I carefully opened the envelope, and as another folded sheet slipped onto the table, Margaret suddenly gasped. "Richard." He never found the second page. Margaret's voice shook as she whispered, "Richard." He never found the second page. Daniel looked back and forth between us in confusion. "Second page? What are you talking about?" I slowly unfolded the paper that had slipped from the envelope. It was yellow with age, and the handwriting belonged to my father. I had not seen those words in more than 25 years. My hands trembled as I began reading silently. After only a few lines, I closed my eyes. The room remained completely still. Daniel stepped closer. "Dad, please tell me what it says." I looked at my son and quietly handed him the letter. "Read it aloud." Everyone deserves to hear it." His voice was unsteady as he began. "Richard, if Daniel ever reads the first page of my letter, make sure he also reads this one. The truth is not that Richard is hiding another father. The truth is that I spent years trying to destroy my own son's marriage because of my pride." Daniel stopped reading and stared at me in disbelief. "Grandpa wrote this?" I nodded silently. Margaret wiped away her tears. "Keep reading." Daniel swallowed hard before continuing. "When Richard married Margaret, I believed she came from a family beneath ours. I never accepted her. I hoped that if I planted enough doubt inside Daniel's mind, one day he would turn against his parents. I was wrong. If you are reading this after I am gone, then I have carried this shame to my grave." Daniel's hands began shaking uncontrollably. Every word seemed heavier than the last. He looked at me with tears filling his eyes. "Dad, why did you never tell me Grandpa hated Mom?" I quietly smiled. "Because he was still my father. I wanted you to remember the good parts of him, not the worst." Daniel lowered his head in shame. "Instead, I believe the worst about you." Margaret gently placed her hand on his shoulder. "Your grandfather was not an evil man. He was simply a man who allowed pride to become stronger than love." Daniel folded the letter and slowly sat down. "I accuse the one man who never stopped protecting me." Just then, the doorbell rang. None of us were expecting visitors. I walked toward the front door and opened it. Standing on the porch was a woman I had not seen in over 30 years. The moment I recognized her face, my heart nearly stopped. She quietly looked into my eyes and said, "Richard, I think it is finally time your son learned what happened before he was born." The woman stood quietly on my front porch, holding a small leather purse against her chest. Time had changed her face, but I recognized her immediately. "Emily Harper," I whispered. Daniel looked at me in confusion. "Dad, who is she?" Emily took a slow breath before answering. "I was your mother's closest friend before you were born." Margaret's face turned pale the moment she saw her. Tears filled her eyes. "Emily, after all these years?" Emily nodded sadly. "I never wanted to come back, Margaret. But after hearing what happened with the DNA test, I realized I could not stay silent any longer." I invited her inside. The living room was so quiet that every footstep echoed across the wooden floor. Emily sat down, reached into her purse, and carefully removed an old photograph. She handed it to Daniel. It showed Margaret and Emily standing together outside a small hospital. Margaret was holding a newborn baby wrapped in a blue blanket. Daniel looked closely at the picture before whispering, "That baby is me." Emily smiled gently. "Yes. And that photograph was taken the day after you were born." Daniel frowned. "What is so important about it?" Emily pointed toward the date printed in the corner. Daniel's eyes suddenly widened. "This date, it is 3 weeks before Dad came home from military service." He looked at me in complete confusion. "Dad, how could you be holding me if you were not even home yet?" Margaret immediately began crying. I quietly closed my eyes because I knew the question had finally arrived. Emily reached into her purse once more and placed an old hospital envelope on the table. "Richard," she said softly, "I kept these records because Margaret asked me to protect them until the day Daniel needed the truth." Daniel's breathing became heavier. "Mom, what truth?" Margaret slowly took his hand. "The DNA test did not lie, Daniel. Richard is your biological father. But there is something about your birth that we never wanted you to carry for the rest of your life." Daniel stared at both of us, unable to speak. Emily gently pushed the hospital envelope toward him. "Everything you need to know is inside." With trembling hands, Daniel opened the envelope. The very first document he pulled out made his face lose all color. Across the top, in bold letters, it read, "Confidential Adoption Emergency Record." Daniel stared at the words, "Confidential Adoption Emergency Record," as though the paper had suddenly become too heavy to hold. He looked at me, then at his mother. "Mom, Dad, what is this? You just said he is my biological father." Margaret gently nodded. "He is, Daniel. Every word of the DNA report is true." Daniel shook his head. "Then why does this file mention adoption?" Emily quietly leaned forward. "Because you were never adopted by another family. You were legally adopted by your own parents." Daniel frowned in complete confusion. "That does not make any sense." Margaret wiped away her tears before speaking. "The day you were born, there was a terrible fire in the hospital nursery. The evacuation was chaotic. Several babies were moved to emergency shelters, and for almost 24 hours, no one could confirm which child belonged to which family." Daniel slowly lowered the papers into his lap. The room was completely silent. The hospital believed you had died in the fire, Margaret whispered. We were told there was no hope. Your father nearly collapsed after hearing the news. I closed my eyes as memories I had spent decades trying to forget returned. I searched every hospital in the county, I said quietly. I refused to believe you were gone. Emily reached into the folder and removed another document. 3 days later, a nurse discovered that one infant had been mistakenly transferred to another emergency facility under the wrong identification number. That baby was Daniel. Daniel stared at the report in disbelief. So I was found? Margaret nodded through her tears. Yes, but because your medical records had already been closed. After the hospital believed you had died, the court required us to complete an emergency adoption process to restore your legal identity. On paper, we had to adopt our own biological son. Daniel covered his face with both hands. I never knew. I gently smiled. We promised each other that once you were old enough, we would tell you. Then life became busy. Years passed. Every birthday made it harder to know the right moment. Emily quietly added, Your grandfather found those court papers years later, but he never understood what they meant. Instead of asking questions, he created his own story. Daniel looked down at the adoption order once again. His voice trembled. One misunderstanding changed our family for decades. Before anyone could answer, he unfolded the final document inside the folder. His eyes widened as he whispered, Dad, why does this page say someone tried to claim me before you and Mom found me? Daniel's hands began shaking again as he stared at the final page inside the hospital file. Dad, why does this report say someone tried to claim me before you and Mom found me? Margaret immediately lowered her head. Emily quietly closed her eyes, as though she had hoped that page would never be read. I slowly took a deep breath, because I knew there was no hiding the truth anymore. Because someone did try to take you, I answered. Daniel looked at me in disbelief. Who? I gently pulled the document closer and pointed to a name that had been blacked out years earlier. The hospital never released the person's identity publicly because the investigation was sealed. Daniel frowned. Then how do you know? I remained silent for several seconds before replying. Because I saw that person with my own eyes. The room became completely still. Margaret reached for my hand. Richard, she whispered. I nodded. It is time. I looked directly at Daniel. While every parent was searching for their children after the fire, I noticed a woman carrying a baby through the hospital parking lot. Something did not feel right. When she saw me running toward her, she panicked and drove away before the police arrived. Daniel stared at me without blinking. You think she was carrying me? I slowly nodded. The police believed she had mistaken another baby for her own during the chaos. But I never believed that story. Emily carefully removed another faded newspaper clipping from the folder. The headline read, Missing Infant Found Safe After Hospital Fire. Beneath the article was a grainy photograph of me holding Daniel outside the emergency ward. Emily quietly pointed toward the corner of the picture. Look carefully. Daniel leaned closer. Standing several feet behind me was the same unknown woman, partially hidden behind a police officer. She was staring directly at the baby in my arms. Daniel looked back at me. You never told anyone about this? I quietly smiled. I told the detectives. They searched for her for months, but never found enough evidence to charge anyone. Daniel slowly folded the newspaper clipping. So for 42 years, someone out there knew exactly who I was. Before I could answer, Emily reached into the bottom of the folder and froze. Her face turned completely pale. This was not here the last time. I opened this file. She carefully pulled out a small white envelope. Across the front, in fresh black ink, were 6 words that made every person in the room stop breathing. I have waited 42 years. Emily stared at the white envelope as though she had seen a ghost. Richard, I swear this envelope was not inside the file when I stored it 20 years ago. Daniel carefully picked it up. There was no stamp, no return address, and no signature. Only 6 words written in neat black ink. I have waited 42 years. My heart began pounding. Do not open it yet, I said quietly. Daniel looked at me in confusion. Why not? Before I could answer, the telephone on the living room table suddenly rang. The sound echoed through the silent house. Nobody moved. After the 3rd ring, I slowly answered. Richard Collins speaking. A calm, elderly woman's voice replied, Did you find my letter? Every hair on the back of my neck stood up. Who is this? She ignored my question. Your son deserves the truth now. Open the envelope. The line went dead. I slowly lowered the receiver. Daniel's face had turned pale. She knew about the letter. Margaret stepped closer to me. Richard, could it really be her? I nodded slowly. After all these years, I believe it is. Daniel carefully broke the seal and unfolded a single handwritten page. His voice shook as he began reading aloud. My name is Evelyn Brooks. 42 years ago, I was the woman everyone believed tried to steal your baby. I did not kidnap him. I was trying to save him. Daniel stopped reading and looked at me in disbelief. Save me? Emily whispered. Keep reading. Daniel continued. The hospital fire was not an accident. I saw someone deliberately start it to destroy medical records connected to illegal newborn trafficking. I grabbed the nearest baby because smoke was filling the nursery. I believed I was carrying him to safety. Before I reached the parking lot, people began chasing me, believing I had kidnapped the child. I panicked and ran. When I realized the police had safely returned the baby to his parents, I disappeared because no one would have believed my story. Daniel lowered the paper. The room was completely silent. I looked at Margaret. Neither of us had ever heard such a claim before. Then Daniel unfolded the bottom half of the letter. Taped to it was an old photograph. It showed a young nurse standing beside the nursery only minutes before the fire. Daniel's breathing became heavy as he turned the picture toward me. My blood ran cold. I recognized the nurse immediately. She had attended every one of my father's birthday parties for years. I could not take my eyes off the photograph. The young nurse standing beside the nursery was smiling at the camera, but I recognized her immediately. Her name was Linda Mercer, I whispered. Margaret looked over my shoulder and gasped. Richard, she worked at the hospital for years. Daniel frowned. Did you know her? I slowly nodded. Not well. But there was someone who knew her very well. My voice became quieter. Your grandfather. Daniel stared at me in disbelief. Grandpa? Emily carefully took the photograph and turned it over. Written on the back were 7 words that froze every person in the room. Ask George Collins about Linda Mercer. George Collins was my late father. Daniel looked at me with confusion. Dad, are you saying Grandpa knew the nurse? I took a deep breath. When I was a boy, Linda came to our house several times. Father always introduced her as an old family friend. After I married your mother, I never saw her again. Margaret slowly sat down, trying to process everything. Richard, if your father knew Linda, then this story is much bigger than a misunderstanding. Daniel unfolded the letter again. There was one final paragraph he had not read. His voice trembled as he continued. If you ever receive this letter, it means I no longer have enough time to stay silent. I have lived with this secret for 42 years. I kept every document that proves what happened. I am ready to tell the truth, but I cannot do it over a letter. Please come to Green Valley Care Center before it is too late. Daniel looked up. She is still alive. Emily quietly nodded. If she sent this recently, she must be. I walked toward the window and looked outside. For decades, I believed the hospital fire was a terrible accident that ended with our son safely returning home. Now every answer seemed to create even more questions. Margaret gently touched my arm. Richard, we have to go. I nodded slowly. Yes, we have waited 42 years, without even knowing it. Daniel folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket. If this woman is telling the truth, then everything our family believed about that day has been incomplete. Just as we prepared to leave, my cell phone vibrated. An unknown number appeared on the screen. I answered immediately. A weak, elderly voice whispered only one sentence before the call disconnected. Do not trust anyone carrying the Collins family name, because one of them started the fire. The words from the mysterious phone call echoed in my mind the entire drive to Green Valley Care Center. Do not trust anyone carrying the Collins family name, because one of them started the fire. Daniel kept both hands tightly wrapped around the steering wheel. Neither of us spoke for several miles. Margaret quietly stared out the window while Emily held the old photograph against her chest. When we finally arrived, a nurse greeted us with a worried expression. Are you here to see Mrs. Evelyn Brooks? She asked. I nodded. Her smile disappeared. You are just in time. She has been asking for Richard Collins since early this morning. My heart began racing. We followed the nurse through a long hallway until she stopped outside room 214. She is very weak, the nurse whispered. Please do not tire her. I slowly pushed the door open. An elderly woman lay quietly in bed, her silver hair resting against the pillow. The moment she saw me, tears filled her eyes. Richard, she whispered, I never believed I would live long enough to see you again. I walked closer and gently took her hand. You sent the letter? She nodded. Yes, I have carried this burden for 42 years. Daniel stepped beside me. Were you really trying to save me? Evelyn looked directly into his eyes. Yes, Daniel. I did not even know your name that day. I only knew there was smoke everywhere, and babies were crying. She reached toward the bedside table and pointed to a locked metal box. Everything is inside. I carefully opened the box with the key lying beside it. Inside were dozens of old hospital documents, newspaper clippings, photographs, and one small cassette tape labeled Fire Investigation, Private Recording. Daniel looked at me in disbelief. She kept all of this? Evelyn smiled weakly. Because I knew one day someone would finally ask the right questions, I picked up the cassette tape. What is on this? Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment before answering. A conversation I secretly recorded the night after the fire. I was hiding outside the hospital. Administrator's office when two people admitted what really happened. Margaret's breathing became heavier. Who were they? Evelyn slowly pointed toward the tape. One voice belongs to the hospital. Director. She paused before, whispering the words that made my blood run cold. The other voice belongs to someone in the Collins family. Just as I reached for the old cassette player sitting inside the box, the lights in Evelyn's room suddenly went out, and someone quietly turned the doorknob from the outside. The room fell into complete darkness. Margaret instinctively grabbed my arm, while Daniel stepped in front of us. The only sound was the slow turning of the doorknob. My heart pounded as the door slowly opened. A flashlight beam swept across the room before stopping on Evelyn's face. Who is there? Daniel shouted. No one answered. A shadow quickly stepped inside, reached toward the bedside table, and grabbed the metal box containing the hospital records. Stop! I yelled as Daniel lunged forward. The stranger shoved him hard against the wall and ran into the dark hallway. Daniel ignored the pain and chased after the figure without hesitation. I followed as quickly as I could. Nurses rushed into the corridor, confused by the sudden commotion. The emergency lights finally flickered on, revealing a man running toward the rear exit with the metal box under his arm. Security! Someone shouted. Daniel caught up to him near the exit doors and tackled him to the floor. The metal box slid across the hallway, scattering photographs and documents everywhere. The stranger struggled desperately, but security guards arrived seconds later and pinned him to the ground. As one guard removed the man's baseball cap, I froze. I recognized him immediately. Peter Lawson, I whispered. Daniel looked at me in confusion. You know him? I nodded slowly. He worked as my father's accountant for more than 20 years. Peter lowered his head, refusing to look at me. A security officer picked up his wallet and handed it to me. Inside was a business card with only one name printed on it. Harold Collins. Daniel frowned. Dad, who is Harold Collins? My hands began trembling. My father's younger brother, Margaret gasped. Richard, everyone believed Uncle Harold died 30 years ago. Peter finally spoke, his voice shaking. He is alive, and he ordered me to recover that box. Before you heard the recording, the hallway became completely silent. Daniel stared at the man in disbelief. Why would my great-uncle care about a 42-year-old cassette tape? Peter slowly looked up. Because if you listen to it, you will learn that the hospital fire was never an accident, and Harold Collins helped cover it up. Before anyone could ask another question, a nurse came running from Evelyn's room, her face filled with panic. Mr. Collins, please hurry. Evelyn is asking for you. She says there is one name on that tape you must hear before it is too late. I ran back to Evelyn's room with Daniel and Margaret close behind me. Evelyn's breathing had become shallow, but the moment she saw the cassette tape still lying in my hands, a faint smile appeared on her face. Thank God. They did not take it, she whispered. I pulled a small cassette player from the metal box and carefully inserted the tape. The old machine clicked before the recording began. At first there was only static. Then two voices slowly became clear. The first belonged to the hospital director. The police believe the fire was an electrical accident. If nobody talks, this will be over by tomorrow. A second voice answered immediately. My blood turned cold the moment I heard it. It was Harold Collins. Good. The missing records can never be recovered. Those adoption files would destroy too many important people. Daniel looked at me in disbelief. He admitted it. The tape continued playing. Harold laughed quietly before saying, As for the nurse who saw everything, she will disappear before sunrise. Evelyn closed her eyes. That nurse was me, she whispered. My hands tightened around the cassette player. The recording continued. The hospital director asked, What about the child who was found? Harold replied calmly, "It does not matter. Once the paperwork disappears, nobody will ever understand what really happened that night." Daniel looked at the emergency. Adoption papers scattered across the bed. "That is why our records were missing." Evelyn nodded weakly. "Yes, the fire was used to destroy evidence connected to illegal newborn trafficking. Most of the files disappeared forever." Margaret covered her mouth in horror. I stopped the cassette and looked directly at Evelyn. "Why did Harold help them?" Tears rolled down her face. "Because he was not protecting the hospital. He was protecting someone inside your own family." Daniel stepped closer. "Who?" Evelyn slowly reached beneath her pillow and removed one final sealed envelope. Her hands shook so badly that I had to help her hold it. Across the front she had written only one sentence. "Open this only after you hear the tape." I carefully broke the seal. Inside was an old birth certificate, a faded family photograph, and a handwritten confession. My eyes widened before I could even read the first paragraph. At the top of the page was one sentence that changed everything. "I thought I knew about my own family. Richard, Harold Collins was never your uncle." My hands froze. I read the first line again because I could not believe what I had just seen. "Richard, Harold Collins was never your uncle." Daniel leaned closer. "Dad, what does that mean?" My voice barely came out. "I do not know." Evelyn slowly opened her eyes and looked at me. "Keep reading." I unfolded the remaining pages. They were written in careful handwriting, each sentence revealing another piece of a secret buried for more than 40 years. Harold Collins changed his identity before Richard was born. He was not the younger brother of George Collins. He was George's cousin. After both of Richard's grandparents died, George secretly altered family documents, so Harold could inherit property that did not belong to him. Daniel stared at me in disbelief. "Grandpa helped him?" I nodded silently, unable to speak. Margaret gently squeezed my hand. "Richard, your father spent years protecting Harold." I continued reading. Harold later became involved with businessmen connected to illegal adoption records. When the hospital fire happened, he believed the destroyed files would also erase evidence linking him to those people. Evelyn struggled to sit up. "George was never part of the trafficking," she whispered. "But he knew Harold was guilty, and instead of reporting him, he protected the family name." Daniel lowered his head. "That is why Grandpa kept trying to distract me with stories about Dad. He wanted me looking in the wrong direction." Evelyn nodded weakly. "Exactly." I unfolded the last sheet inside the envelope. It was a certified birth record with several official stamps. The name listed beneath father immediately caught my attention. George Collins. But the name beneath mother was not my grandmother. I looked again, hoping I had misread it. I had not. Margaret noticed my expression. "Richard, what is wrong?" I slowly handed her the paper. She gasped the moment she saw it. "This says your father had another child." Daniel looked back and forth between us. "Another child?" I quietly nodded. "Yes, and according to this record, that child was born only 11 months before I was." The room fell completely silent. Evelyn looked directly into my eyes. "Richard, you have spent your whole life believing you were an only child." She paused before taking a slow breath. "You were not." Just then, my cell phone vibrated. An unknown message appeared on the screen. It contained only one sentence. "Your brother already knows the truth." I stared at the message until the words became blurred. "Your brother already knows the, truth." Daniel slowly took the phone from my hand and read it twice. "Dad, someone knows exactly what we have discovered." Margaret looked around the room nervously. "Richard, whoever is sending these messages has been watching us." Evelyn quietly nodded. "I warned you." The people hiding this secret never truly disappeared. My heart was pounding. For 73 years, I believed I had no brothers or sisters. Now a single message was telling me that somewhere, another son of George Collins had been living an entirely different life. I looked at Evelyn. "Do you know who he is?" She slowly shook her head. "I only know he exists. George arranged for the baby and his mother to leave town before anyone could ask questions." Daniel frowned. "Why would Grandpa hide his own child?" Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment. "Because admitting the truth would have destroyed his reputation. In those days, protecting a family name meant more to some people than protecting their own family." I quietly sat down beside the hospital bed, struggling to understand everything I had just learned. Margaret gently placed the birth certificate back into the envelope. "Richard, if this is true, then somewhere you have spent your entire life missing a brother you never even knew existed, Before I could answer, my phone rang again. The same unknown number appeared on the screen. I answered immediately. "Who are you?" A calm man's voice replied. "You already know enough to find me." I tightened my grip on the phone. "Are you my brother?" There was a long silence before he finally answered. "Yes." Daniel's eyes widened. Margaret covered her mouth in shock. The man continued speaking. "I have known about you for 20 years. I wanted to meet you many times, but every time I tried, someone warned me to stay away from the Collins family." My voice trembled. "Who warned you?" His answer came without hesitation. "Harold." I felt the blood drain from my face. "Where are you?" The man sighed softly. "I cannot tell you over the phone. Harold has people watching me, but tomorrow morning I will be waiting at the old Collins farmhouse where your father grew up. Before I could ask another question, he quietly added one final sentence. "Bring the cassette tape, because it proves something about my mother that even you do not know." The call ended. I slowly lowered the phone and looked at my family. After 42 years of searching for one truth, we were now walking toward another secret that had been buried for more than 70 years. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, Daniel and I drove toward the old Collins farmhouse. Margaret insisted on coming, and Emily followed in her own car with the cassette tape locked inside a small metal case. None of us spoke during the drive. Every mile felt like we were moving closer to a truth that had been hidden for generations. When the farmhouse finally came into view, it looked exactly as I remembered from childhood. The paint had faded, the front porch leaned to one side, and the old oak tree still stood beside the barn. A gray pickup truck was already parked outside. A man in his early 70s stepped out the moment we stopped. The instant our eyes met, I felt something impossible to explain. He looked like me. The same eyes, the same jawline. Even the way he stood reminded me of my father. He slowly walked toward us and stopped only a few feet away. "Richard?" he asked quietly. I nodded. "Yes." His eyes filled with tears. "My name is Thomas, and I have waited my entire life to say hello to my brother." Neither of us moved for several seconds. Then, without another word, we embraced each other. Daniel quietly wiped away tears while Margaret stood silently beside the car. Thomas reached into his jacket and handed me a worn photograph. It showed our father standing beside a young woman I had never seen before. She was holding a baby wrapped in a blanket. "That baby is me," Thomas said softly. "My mother kept this picture, hidden until the day she died." I carefully turned the photograph over. On the back, my father's handwriting read, "One day I hope my sons forgive me." My hands began trembling. "He knew," I whispered. Thomas nodded. "He knew everything. He wanted to tell you many times, but Harold convinced him that exposing the truth would destroy both families." Emily unlocked the metal case and handed Thomas the cassette tape. He stared at it for several moments before quietly saying, "This recording proves my mother was telling the truth all along." Daniel frowned. "What truth?" Thomas looked directly at him. "My mother was the nurse who reported the newborn trafficking years before the hospital fire. Harold tried to silence her because she refused to help him." My heart nearly stopped. "Your mother was involved too?" Thomas nodded slowly. "She was not part of the crime. She was the first person brave enough to fight it." Before anyone could speak again, the sound of another vehicle echoed across the empty field. A black SUV stopped in front of the farmhouse. The driver's door opened, and Harold Collins slowly stepped out, holding a revolver in his hand. The moment Harold Collins stepped out of the black SUV, every conversation stopped. He looked much older than I remembered, but the cold expression on his face had not changed. The revolver in his hand remained pointed toward the ground as he slowly walked closer. Daniel instinctively stepped in front of Margaret, while Thomas quietly moved beside me. Harold looked directly into my eyes and smiled without warmth. "Richard, I warned everyone to leave the past buried." My voice remained calm. "You buried lies, Harold. We came here to uncover the truth." Harold laughed softly. "Truth?" He shook his head. "Truth has never protected a family. Secrets do." Thomas stepped forward. "You destroyed my mother's life because she refused to stay silent." Harold's smile disappeared. "Your mother should have minded her own business." Daniel could not stay quiet any longer. "People died because of what you did." Harold looked at him with complete indifference. "People always die. The only question is whether the family survives." Those words made me realize he felt no guilt at all. Emily slowly lifted the metal case containing the cassette tape. "It is over, Harold. We have the recording." Harold immediately raised the revolver. "Then give it to me." No one moved. The wind carried dust across the old farmhouse yard as silence filled the air. I slowly took one step forward. "You are too late." Harold frowned. "What do you mean?" I quietly reached into my jacket and removed my cell phone. "An hour ago, Daniel sent copies of every document, every photograph, and the entire cassette recording to the state police and 3 national newspapers." Harold's face lost all color. "You are lying." Daniel held up his own phone. "No, we also uploaded everything to secure online storage. Even if you destroy every piece of evidence here, thousands of copies already exist." Harold's hand began shaking. For the first time since arriving, fear appeared in his eyes. He looked around as though searching for a way to escape. Just then, the distant sound of police sirens echoed across the countryside. Thomas quietly smiled. "They found you before you found us." Harold slowly lowered the revolver. The years of confidence disappeared from his face in a single moment. He looked at me with tired eyes and whispered, "Richard, your father begged me to confess before he died." I stared at him in silence. "Then why did you not?" Harold looked toward the old farmhouse before answering with a broken voice. "Because I was too much of a coward to lose everything." At that exact moment, 6 police vehicles turned onto the gravel road, surrounding the farmhouse from every direction. Police officers surrounded the farmhouse within seconds. "Drop the weapon," one officer shouted. Harold looked at the revolver in his trembling hand before slowly placing it on the ground. He did not try to run. He did not argue. The years of lies had finally become too heavy to carry. 2 detectives walked toward him, placed him in handcuffs, and carefully read his rights. As they led him toward a patrol car, Harold suddenly stopped and turned back to face me. His eyes were filled with regret for the first time. "Richard," he whispered, "there is something you deserve to know before I leave." The detective allowed him a few more seconds. Harold lowered his head. "Your father was never part of the newborn trafficking. He spent the rest of his life trying to repair the damage I caused. Every lie he told, every secret he kept, was his foolish attempt to protect the family after I threatened to destroy all of you." Tears filled my eyes. I had spent years believing my father chose lies over truth. Now I realized he had spent decades trapped between protecting his children and exposing his own cousin. Harold continued speaking. "George begged me to surrender many times. I refused. The guilt slowly destroyed him." I closed my eyes as memories of my father returned. His quiet sadness suddenly made sense. Before the officers placed Harold inside the patrol car, he looked at Thomas. "Your mother was the bravest person I ever knew. She deserved far better than the life I gave her." Thomas did not answer. He simply turned away. As the police convoy drove off, silence settled over the old farmhouse. Daniel slowly walked toward me. His eyes were red from crying. "Dad," he whispered, "I secretly took a DNA test because I believed you had hidden the truth from me." He lowered his head in shame. "Instead, I learned that you spent your entire life protecting this family while other people kept the real secrets." I gently placed my hand on his shoulder. "Son, every family carries pain. What matters is whether we allow that pain to separate us or bring us back together." Daniel wrapped his arms around me without saying another word. Margaret quietly joined us, followed by Thomas. For the first time in our lives, the 4 of us stood together as one family. I looked toward the old farmhouse one final time before we left. I believed the darkest chapter of the Collins family had finally ended. I had no idea that one final letter, hidden inside my father's old Bible, was still waiting to change everything forever. A week after Harold Collins was arrested, the state police officially closed the investigation that had haunted our family for more than 4 decades. News stations called it one of the largest cover-ups ever uncovered in our county. Reporters waited outside our home every day, hoping for interviews, but I refused every request. I had not spent 73 years protecting my family just to place our pain on television. Instead, I asked Daniel, Margaret, Thomas, and Emily to meet me at my late father's old farmhouse one final time. Before the property was sold, there was one place I needed to visit alone. I quietly walked upstairs to my father's bedroom. Everything looked exactly as he had left it. His reading glasses still rested beside the window. His favorite chair still faced the fireplace. On the small wooden table lay his old Bible. I slowly picked it up, intending only to keep it as a family memory. As I opened it, a folded envelope slipped onto the floor. Across the front, written in my father's familiar handwriting, were the words for Richard, "If the truth ever finds you." My hands began trembling. I carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single handwritten letter. My son, if you are reading this, then the secrets I was too weak to confess have finally been uncovered. I know you will be angry with me, and you have every right to be. I failed you, Thomas, and everyone I loved because I believed silence could protect a family. I was wrong. Silence only protects those who do evil. Tears blurred my vision as I continued reading. I loved both of my sons equally, even though I did not have the courage to raise you together. Harold controlled my life through fear, and every year I waited for the right moment to tell you the truth. That moment never came. Please do not allow my failures to become yours. Bring your family together. Forgive where you can. Speak the truth while there is still time. I quietly folded the letter and walked back downstairs. Daniel, Thomas, Margaret, and Emily were waiting outside beneath the old oak tree. Without saying a word, I handed the letter to Daniel. He read every line aloud. By the time he reached the final sentence, none of us could hold back our tears. Thomas looked at me and quietly said, "Brother, Father made terrible mistakes, but his last wish was simple. He wanted us to become the family he never had the courage to build." I slowly nodded. "Then we will honor that wish." At that moment, Daniel looked at both of us before asking the one question none of us had expected. "Would both of you stand beside me when my first grandson is born next month, so my child grows up knowing the entire family from the very beginning?" 1 month later, our entire family gathered at the hospital for a very different reason than the one that had changed our lives 42 years earlier. This time, there was no fear, no confusion, and no missing child. There was only hope. As the nurse gently placed Daniel's newborn grandson into his arms, he immediately walked toward me and Thomas. With tears in his eyes, he smiled and said, "This little boy will never grow up surrounded by secrets. He will know exactly who his family is from his very first day." I gently kissed my great-grandson on the forehead. Thomas stood beside me, smiling through his tears. "Father would have wanted this," he whispered. I quietly nodded. "Yes, and this time we are finally giving him the ending he dreamed of." A few weeks later, the old Collins farmhouse was sold, but before the new owners moved in, our family gathered beneath a giant oak tree one final time. Daniel carefully buried my father's letter beneath its roots. "Let the lies stay here," he said softly. "Only the truth will leave this place with us." Everyone stood together in silence. Margaret slipped her hand into mine exactly as she had done throughout our marriage. Emily smiled peacefully, knowing she had finally fulfilled the promise she made more than 40 years earlier. Thomas looked toward the farmhouse before quietly saying, "I spent my whole life believing I had lost a brother. Today, I know I simply found him late." I wrapped my arm around his shoulder and smiled. "Late is still better than never." Daniel then turned toward me, his voice filled with emotion. "Dad, I secretly took a DNA test because I believed it would expose your lies. Instead, it exposed your love. Blood proved you were my biological father, but your actions proved something far greater. You were the greatest father I could ever have asked for." I looked at my son, my brother, my wife, my grandchildren, and my great-grandson. Every painful secret, every hidden letter, every misunderstanding, and every lost year had finally led us to this single moment. I quietly whispered, "A family is not destroyed by the truth. A family is destroyed by the fear of telling it." As the evening sun disappeared behind the old oak tree, I realized that the DNA test had never truly been about proving who my son belonged to. It had become the key that unlocked generations of hidden pain and finally gave our family the chance to heal. And if there is one lesson my life has taught me, it is this: love may begin with blood, but it survives only through honesty, forgiveness, and the courage to stand together when the truth finally comes home. The end.